Thank you, Dr. Stas. Thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody. I know it's a morning time, and we're just getting used to our schedule for the day. Um, so before I start my presentation, what I would like from audience to know is how many of you guys do the spinal cord stimulator for painful condition? Just raise your hand so I get an idea who my audience are. And how many of you do the stimulator for non-painful conditions? Anybody? Okay, I got at least one hand. Okay, that sounds good. So this, this my topic is something which we are talking about, like as the medical field advances over the time, is where we were like 30 years ago and how we are heading going forward in terms of the indications for the spinal cord stimulation. Uh, so what we are going to do is we are going to divide this topic into a couple parts. The first part is I'm going to talk about is uh, what we know about the spinal cord stimulator itself, like as a mechanism of action, what we knew like 30 years ago, what we know now, and potentially in the future, which direction we are heading forward. The second is the neurological conditions which we have known so far, the mechanism of action, what is happening at the neurotransmitter level, and how we can connect the two dots and see if we can help those patients who are suffering from neurological disorders, and we can apply the knowledge of mechanism of action of a spinal cord stimulator to help those patients. Then we'll talk about like common indications, what we have seen in the literature so far, where we are using the spinal cord stimulation therapy, whether it's a deep brain stimulation or a peripheral stimulation, how the leads are placed, and briefly looking at some of the studies which is out there. So I know there's a lot of things to catch up, but I'll try to keep justice to the time and try not to take too long for as we move forward. These are some of my financial disclosures. So I think we covered that part. So first thing is looking at the pathophysiologic, at neurological disorders. What I'm going to cover, a couple of the disorders here is, one is Parkinsonism disease, depression, epilepsy, obstructed sleep apnea, and so basically what I wanted, this is a very important slide. What we're looking at is that in terms of neurological disorders, when we see them, what we know so far is that it's a very complex changes at the chemical or at the cellular level, where different nerve fibers are released, glutamate, dopaminergic fibers, serotonin, and things like that. So far, traditionally, what we have done is we have used the medications to help modulate those nerve fibers or the neurotransmitter. And one of the side effects which we suffer from the medication is the unwarranted side effects, like affects the areas which we don't want, or some of them has a systemic side effect. So sometimes these patients who are elderly, who are suffering from neurological disorder, they suffer from unwarranted side effects for those patients with those conditions. What we knew so far and traditionally about the spinal cord stimulator was that when we were using low frequency stimulation to help our patients who were suffering from back pain for many years, and when I was a fellow, I was taught about the gate control theory, the idea behind that was that how the spinal cord stimulator helps in the back pain was that in the spinal cord, there is practically three pathways. One is the anterolateral pathway, the second is the posterior pathway. And what we are doing is that for helping in the pain signals to block the conduction of the anterolateral pathway and reaching to the brain, we are stimulating the posterior pathway, which is the vibration or a tingling sensation. And with that, what we were achieving was a painful control of the pain. By the gate theory, basically, we are preventing one kind of signals to go to the brain and blocking it. Now, over the years, what happened was there many other different waveforms came in, frequency came in, functional MRI came in, and what we looked, and there are some studies which came out in rats and other, we found out was that it is not that everything which is happening at the spinal level, when we looked at functional MRI, we also look at the chemical transmitters, that it is also affecting in the brain, at the midbrain level, at the cortical level. When we looked at the chemical receptors like glutamate, serotonin, there was changes in that. So we thought that it's not as simple as we thought to begin with. And then what actually made me thinking was that recently I did a study myself, we published it about, I think, last year. So this was kind of investigator-initiated study. What we looked at traditionally we were used to giving, stimulation all the time, and the patients when we were giving for the low frequency stimulation. So what we did was that we had patients in which we gave 100% of the stimulation, one category. The second, we had given 50% of the stimulation. And the third category, and where we were giving 13% of the time, 14% of the time the stimulation. What we found was the patients who were getting the stimulation 14% of the time actually did better than the one who were getting 100% or 50%. And I'm coming to the pulse dosing. Recently, I published an article on that. So what made me think was that if the patients who are getting stimulated at 14%, if they are doing better than the one which are getting stimulated at 100%, then it's not a conventional gate theory. There is something else going on because there is some residual effect of the neurotransmitters which is contributing to that. So with that, right now I'm conducting the study in which we are going further down where the stimulation and the pulse dosing is going down on those patients, and I'll share the data in the coming time, how those patients are doing it. So what we know is that, so far is that, whenever we stimulate with electrical current, it is stimulating the WDR receptors, which is going to the brain. Hyperactive pain neurons are implicated in the chronic pain pathway, and it is releasing the neurotransmitters locally. What we know is that at low frequency stimulation, there is a different nerve fibers potentially. When we go from low frequency, we change the amplitude, we change the current, frequency, or a pulse weight. There's a different nerve fibers potentially which we are stimulating, whether it's in the brain or the suprathalamic level for those patients. And at high frequency, maybe potentially, perhaps we might be stimulating dorsal Hall sense, and we are inhibiting the neurotransmitters like GABAergic at those patients. So this is another slide to look at it. Basically, that what's happening is that now we know is that all the mechanism of action is just not happening at the spinal level. We are thinking it is at the midbrain, pons, medulla, and also neurotransmitter changes in the brain itself, not just at the spinal cord or the dorsal column level or the spinothalamic level. So it might be a combination phenomena, what we are knowing so far. For neurological disorder, coming back to our topic is, the most important thing is when we talk to our neurologist colleagues is whenever somebody has Parkinsonism, stroke, or motor weakness or anything like that, the first thing they look at the localization of the lesion, where exactly it is happening. Is it happening at the spinal cord level? It is happening at the brain? Is it the peripheral nerve which is affected? And I think that's very important for neuromodulators like us to understand as well, is that what are we dealing with? Is this a peripheral nerve problem? Is it the problem at the spinal cord level? Or it is the problem at the brain? And then we can apply our knowledge of neuromodulation, which target area we actually want to stimulate to help the patients who are suffering from neurological disorder. What are the benefits of neuromodulation? One, as I said, as compared to the medications which we use for those patients, it does not have any systemic side effects. We can give a very localized stimulation or current to the, to those patients. What we have also seen early signs recently is that maybe perhaps, we do not know for sure, but early signs are saying that we might be able to modulate the progression of the disease. Like there were some initial studies looking at diabetic neuropathy, that it might make some changes in the neurological, deterioration, or the patients with spinal cord injury or who have weakness. I had a patient in my practice in which who had a near complete amputation of his right hand. I placed a lead in the neck at C2, C3 level. We followed this patient a year later, gained some motor strength. Again, I'm not trying to make an implication of it, but what we are seeing here and there is that there is something to be said about gaining the motor strength when we are stimulating at higher cervical level or at the brain level for the patients who have motor weakness or spinal cord injury. So the first one, this is something which we have incorporated in my practice as well, is an overactive bladder. The first time when I got a referral from a urologist in my practice, I looked at it and I thought about what else can we do. What is overactive bladder? This is a patients typically who are suffering from frequency nocturia without a urinary tract infection or an obvious pathology. Most of the time it's a detrusor muscle, either it's a hyperactivity or a hypoactivity, which is causing those symptoms to the patient. It's a very annoying condition. The treatment options which exist is you can give localized Botox injection, you can do pelvic floor muscle exercises, you can give antimuscarinic medications, but the choices are limited, and sometimes the patients do not have great efficacy, and sometimes they suffer from the systemic side effects as well from those medications. The potential causes, it could be a damage in the brain, spinal cord, it could be a peripheral nerve damage, it could be the injury to the muscle itself or a bladder injury. So it's a multifactorial causes for those patients for the detrusor muscle activity. What are the potential targets which we can stimulate? So I think the answer lies in that we look at the nerve supply of the organ and the pathophysiology itself. What we know is the sacral nerve is activates the afferent or changes the processing at the higher cortical brain nerve stimulation, and in turn can stimulate the detrusor muscle. What we also know is that detrusor, sacral nerve, which is the nerve supply, which is S1, and the posterior tibial nerve, which is L5S1, they crisscrosses. So the hypothesis was that if we can stimulate the posterior nerve fiber, we can actually make the changes in the sacral afferent and can potentially stimulate the detrusor muscle and help in regulating the patients who are suffering from overactive bladder. So what we do is, this is something which we have incorporated in my practice, is that the patients who have been diagnosed with overactive bladder, your posterior tibial nerve is very easy to identify. That's just, we look at the medial malleolus, just inferior to it, medial, and we place like 2 electrical probes. We give the stimulation we do a 30 minutes typically sessions, to a total of 12 sections a week apart. For those patients, and as you can see, it's a very simple electrode placement at the posterior nerve. And what we look at when the patients come back is their subjective complaints of frequency, urgency, or overactive bladder or incontinence. So this was we were using in my practice. Then we also looked at the literature, what is out there for the patients who are suffering from overactive bladder. So this was a meta-analysis, which was a pretty extensive study, which was involved in a 17 randomized controlled trial, looking at total of 3,038 participants, looking at different treatment options, what is out there in the literature for patients who are suffering from overactive bladder. What we found was that urinary frequency reduction was greatest in the patients who were having a sacral nervous stimulation. Then the second was the Botox injection locally, and the third was the posterior tibial. Then we looked at the urinary incontinence episodes per day, and we found that patients with sacral stimulation and posterior tibial nerve stimulation significantly did better than the other conventional treatment. Also looked at the risk of the procedure itself, like urinary tract infections and complications. And the lowest risk was, as you can think about, is the posterior tibial nerve stimulation, because it's an external electrode which are placed. There is no incision or any, it's practically a non-invasive procedure. Also looked at the urinary retention in those patients, and the patients with sacral nerve stimulation did significantly better in that subgroup. So what we found is that posterior tibial nerve stimulation, sacral nerve stimulation, they both are an option, but posterior tibial nerve is a relatively safer option with least side effects in some of patients who are suffering from overactive bladder. This was another study to look at comparing the patients who were offered posterior cutaneous tibial nerve stimulation versus electrical stimulation or a conventional pelvic floor muscle exercises. There were 60 patients enrolled in this study. The mean age was 58.5. And again, those patients were giving 30 minutes stimulation for a total of 6 weeks in this study. As I said, in my practice, we use for 12 weeks, but this was a 6 weeks follow-up. And what we found is that the patients who were offered the posterior tibial stimulation did both of the patients did well, but the patient who were offered the posterior tibial nerve stimulation actually showed better results in terms of their urgency, frequency, and symptoms for the pain control. Not the pain control, for their incontinence and overactive bladder. This is another study which we looked at it at the pelvic floor muscles training with or without tibial nerve stimulation, lifestyle changes. And again, this was 67 patients which were enrolled in it. There was 3 groups in that study. One group only received the lifestyle modification. The second group has a lifestyle modification along with the pelvic floor muscle exercise, and the third group has all of the 3 involved in it, which was lifestyle changes, pelvic floor muscle exercises, and also the posterior tibial nerve stimulation for those patients. all the patients did, better in terms of their symptoms at follow-up. But what we found is the patients who were suffering from urinary frequencies and urgency actually did the best in the group 2 and 3. And when they did a sub-analysis, the patient in the group 3 actually did better than the rest of the group 1 and 2 in those patients. So this is, we also talk about a long-term outcome all the time, like how the patients are doing long-term. So this was very interesting, in this study. I'll skip this one. So what they did was the patients who were offered the posterior tibial stimulation in their practice, they called them, like made a phone call like 7 or 8 years later and asked them how are they doing in terms of their overactive bladder symptoms. And what they found out in this study was that 6 of the 8 participants who had a positive response, and they still said that there's sustained relief in terms of overactive bladder symptoms at the follow-up at 7-year mark when they called, which was pretty substantial, although I know that this is a very small data, which is just 6 patients out of 8 which responded. But I think it's important to know that how these patients are doing long-term as well when they're offered this stimulation. This is about, so in summary, posterior, in my opinion, for the patients who are suffering from overactive bladder, we should consider early in our algorithm of, offering the posterior tibial nerve stimulation to the patient. It's least invasive for the patients. There is no systemic side effects and is cost effective. Sacral stimulation is not, is something which our urogynecologist colleagues does that all the time. They place the lead at S3 through the S3 foramen, stimulate the sacral nerve directly. And there are some studies to look at the efficacy of sacral stimulation as well for the patients who are suffering from overactive bladder for those patients. Coming back, switching the gears, I think we just recently discussed about the vagal nerve stimulator. So I'll not go into too much details about it, but just wanted to briefly throw it out there, what we think potentially can help or how this is working. So what is epilepsy? So basically what happens is in epilepsy is that there is a hypersynchronous discharge from the cortical neurons. Either it's a focal or it's, most of the time it's a focal overactive neurons or the nerve fibers, which is resulting in the seizure episodes for the patients. And so there are many medications traditionally which we have used for epilepsy, which can potentially decrease the overstimulation or a hypersynchronous discharge which are coming from the cortical neurons. We have used different medications, anti-seizure medications, gabapentin, we have used Valproate, and different things on those patients. Vagal nerve stimulation is one of the devices which can potentially help the patients who are suffering from epilepsy. What is the mechanism of action? We don't know clearly, but so far the hypothesis is that it affects on the locus coeruleus, basal forebrain, and the cortical from the vagal afferent, and it is basically decreasing somehow the synchronous discharge which is happening at the nerve fiber, and it's modulating the release of the GABA receptors and the glycine for those patients. This is just a picture to show how the vagal nerve stimulator is placed. On the left side, identify the vagal nerve and place the nerve, the electrical lead in close proximity. If it is implanted, the battery can be implanted in the thoracic area or the upper back based on the convenience. There are multiple studies to look at the efficacy or where we have seen a positive results on the patients who are suffering from epilepsy, where the vagal nerve stimulator can potentially help those patients. The hypothesis comes from the vagal nerve, has an afferent sensory that connects to the nucleus tractus solitarius, which connects to the brainstem and can help in modulating it. Other indication where we have seen the use of neuromodulation is for depression. What we have traditionally used the medication is back in the days, we knew that depression is basically nothing but the change of chemical neurotransmitters in the brain, 5-HT receptors and serotonin receptors. When they are deregulated at the chemical level, that results in the depression. And there could be a multifactorial causes for that. And we were using different medications like serotonin reuptake inhibitors and not selective norepinephrine receptors and things like that. Now, as I was talking earlier in the mechanism of action, that we have learned that from this, either the spinal cord stimulation or the deep brain stimulation, we can introduce a localized focal current and can modulate the nerve fibers at the and we can also make a difference in terms of neurotransmitters which was transmitted. This has a potential to help the patients who are suffering from depression by stimulating the appropriate area. And lastly, I'm going to, then I'm going to talk about, lastly is about the obstructed sleep apnea. Again, this is commonly a condition, could be a multifactorial condition, but the bottom line is what is happening is basically it's a soft tissue which is obstructing the airway when we are sleeping, and it is not causing, that is causing in the sleep apnea. There are multiple treatment out there to help those patients, to help the patient with sleep apnea. We have all heard about the CPAP machine and things like that. So one of the things which we can use the knowledge of neuromodulation to help the patients who are suffering from sleep apnea is the stimulation of the hypoglossal nerve. What we can do is that we can place electrical lead in close proximity, which can be surgically placed close to the hypoglossal nerve. We can stimulate the nerve, and it is basically it's two leads. One is going in close proximity to the hypoglossal nerve, and the second has a sensing part. And what it does it takes the signals from when the respiratory when our breathing is initiated, it stimulates the hypoglossal nerve, and what it does it causes the contraction in the genioglossus muscle, and with that contraction the airway opens up. So this is how basically the leads are placed. And coming back to that, it's a pretty cool way to do it. So if you see in this slide that there is potentially the two leads. One is a sensor which is coming from the intercostal region, and the second is which is coming to the genioglossus. So basically, whenever the breathing is initiated, it causes the contraction of the genioglossus muscle, and which can potentially relieve the obstructed pathway for those patients who are suffering from obstructed sleep apnea. This is how the device is implanted. There are a few of the studies which have looked at the safety and the efficacy of the patients who are suffering from obstructed sleep apnea, how the potential hypoglossal nerve stimulation can help those patients. This is a 12-month follow-up for the study for the patients who were offered the hypoglossal nerve stimulation for obstructed sleep apnea. Parkinsonism disease, this is the last topic which I'm going to cover on the neurological disorder, is that traditionally we have used the spinal cord stimulator for patients who have some pain associated with they have back surgery or something, and they're one of the comorbid or other diagnosis was the Parkinsonism. And doing the neuromodulation for almost 15 years in my practice, sometimes I've seen the patients like anything else, we were seeing back in the days when we were offering for failed back surgery syndrome, the spinal cord stimulator, patient will come back and they will say, my diabetic neuropathic symptoms are better. Not always, but on certain occasions. And we will think, yeah, it can help in the peripheral neuropathy as well. So sometimes we had patients who had lumbar radiculopathy, failed back surgery, and they have Parkinsonism symptoms, which is including rigidity or their mood changes and or axial pain. And they will say that, generally, doctor, I feel bad. I feel better after the spinal cord stimulator. Partly my back is better, but my mood is better. I don't have that much tremor and things like that. So this is just to look at it, the patients who have the patients who are suffering from Parkinsonism disease, what we know is that spinal cord stimulator has a potential when we place a high cervical lead to modulate the dopaminergic receptors and can potentially help the patients who are suffering from Parkinsonism disease. And again, we need to know more about it, how to effectively modulate and selectively modulate the dopaminergic fibers, and maybe we can help in changing the progression of the disease. This was a recent study which was looking at the burst spinal cord stimulation for patients with Parkinsonism disorder for those patients. And they looked at as a viable alternate for the patients in which we can potentially modulate the dopaminergic fibers locally for this. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. I do not want, the idea about this presentation is I just wanted to give a glimpse of where we are heading in terms of spinal cord stimulator, the mechanism of action about the spinal cord stimulation therapy, how we are learning more about the neurological disorders, and how we can think about connecting the two dots. These are all small studies, and of course in the future more prospective studies needs to be done, and we'll have more data to show. But I just wanted to tell the audience where we are heading in terms of spinal cord stimulation, indications, implications for non-painful conditions. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.